I'm going to show you how to draw the hand using 3D shapes. So first of all, we have to decide which hand we're going to be looking at when we're drawing. Obviously, if you're right-handed, you're going to be looking at your left hand. And if you're left-handed, you're going to be looking at your right hand. So let's say you're going to draw here, then you would pose your right hand just like so. Now, how do we pose our hand? We want to make sure our hand is relaxed so that it has a slight curve to it and it's not flat on the table like this. This looks like a hand tracing. It's very unnatural. And the hand is more relaxed. So we're going to draw our hand in a relaxed position. So if you're left-handed, you would be looking at your right hand. And if you're right-handed, you would look at your left hand. So since I am right-handed, I'm going to be demonstrating using my left hand here. Okay. So drawing the hand using 3D shapes. First of all, we got to get our proportions right, okay? So remember that first step when we're drawing something is we create a bounding box. So we have to figure out the bounding box for this hand. Okay, so you could take a look. I've already drawn a square on the back of my hand here because that's the easiest shape we see for the back of the hand. However, I need to get a bounding box that will contain both my fingers and the back of my hand. I feel like this is the easiest, the most basic shape that I can use to represent the hand. So the bounding box would be a rectangle here. Okay, so let's measure the proportion of this rectangle bounding box that's going to hold the back of our hand and also our fingers. Okay, so you're going to get the width of your hand on your pencil, and then you're going to compare that width to the length. Now you can see that I've stopped the bounding box at the top of my wrist where it meets the base of my hand. And I want you guys to imagine that too, where that line is. If you need to, you can just draw, literally, quite literally, like I have, drawn a box on the back of your hand to help you visualize. Okay, so you're going to do the width, and then I'm going to start right here and measure the length of my hand with how many widths. Okay, so as you can see, it's roughly 2 times as long as it is wide. So that's how we're going to draw our bounding box here. 2 times long as it is wide, so 1:2 proportion. I'm going to try to draw the bounding box the same angle as my hand is placed here. I just want to draw it exactly the same size as my hand appears. Okay, so first let's get the width, and you can quite literally take whatever measurement that was on your hand and put it here on your paper. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this width measurement and put it on my paper. Okay, so the reason I'm drawing to the side here is so that I have room for drawing the steps, for writing the steps down. Okay, so first of all, let's get our bounding box drawn. Okay, now what was that first step that we took? We actually measured proportions. So I'm going to write down our first step, which is measure proportions. Okay, so you should write this down too. Measure proportions, that's the first step. Okay, now the second step is drawing the bounding box. So now that we know our proportions, which were 1:2, let's now draw the bounding box. Draw bounding box. Okay. Now let's make sure that the bounding box is in a reasonable area on our paper where we have enough room to draw the entire hand. So you might need to adjust depending on what happened here. Okay, so I decided I think I'm going to need to do this a bit wider. So I'm going to make it a bit wider just so it's a 1-to-1 relationship here. Okay. So I get this width. I'm going to get this width and double it to get the length. So I decided I want to cut my hand off about here. I'm going to do 1. This is halfway. I'm going to do 2. It's fully there. Okay. Okay, so my hand should fit roughly in that box. And if I compare, you can kind of compare your hand. Yeah, that's about right. Okay. Okay, so I've got bounding box, 1:2 proportions. Perfect. Okay, now what's next? Let's take a look at the hand and break it down further into shapes. Okay, so what has not been included in this bounding box here? It's the thumb. Okay, so the thumb, we have to figure out how to draw the thumb using 3D shapes, or 2D shapes, as it were. And so here at the base of the thumb, what shape do you think the base of the thumb can be represented as? It's a triangle. Okay, not just any triangle. Let's say it is a right triangle here. And then the hypotenuse, or the longest side of the right triangle, being arranged right against the box that's holding the base of our hand. Okay, so we're going to look at the proportion of this hypotenuse to the box for the back of our hand. And let's take a look at what that is. It looks like it's a bit farther than halfway. Maybe, would you say 2/3? Okay, 2/3 of the length here. Okay, so let's take a look. We can quite literally measure it and put it here anyhow. So if I measure it, it's about like that, which appears to be about 2/3. Okay, so I've got a measurement there. And let's just draw out a right triangle with the hypotenuse being on the side of the back of the hand. Okay, so I'm just comparing, is it about the right size? Maybe it needs to be a little bit smaller, like so. Don't be afraid to erase. Okay, so it's about like this. Okay, now, we've drawn a triangle for the base of our thumb, so let's write that down. Draw triangle for base of thumb. Okay, so drawing a triangle for the base of the thumb. Now we're going to move on to our next step, which is drawing the arcs for our knuckles and our joints and our fingertips. Okay, so we've got a couple of arcs to draw. Let's take a look at our hand. You see how the knuckles, they're not all even on a same height. There's kind of a swelling to the contour of the hand. So it can't, back of the hand cannot actually be contained in a square. That's just the easiest way to visualize it for measurement. However, you can see this natural arc happening here. There's a natural arc to the knuckles. There's a natural arc to the first joints. There's a natural arc to the second joints, and then also to the fingertips. So we're going to measure, we can't really measure, but let's visualize the arcs and then put them actually on our drawing so we can more accurately gauge where to draw all of these locations. Okay, so I can see that the arc kind of starts the top of the pinky knuckle and goes up a bit higher for the middle fingers, and then arcs back down for the pointer finger. Okay, so I can see the arc of where my knuckles and my fingers start is roughly like so. Okay, now let's take a look at the arc for the first joint. And how far up is that arc actually? Let's measure the proportion of this bounding box here, this top half of the bounding box. Let's measure the distance between the back of the hand and the first joint and compare it. Okay, let's take a look at it. 1 to 2. So you can see roughly this first joint is kind of like halfway between the ends of the fingertips and the knuckles. So that's what we're going to do here, roughly halfway, roughly. So it's going to go to about here, right? But then now we have to make it into an arc. And we see that it arcs above and below here. Okay, so I'm going to draw some arcs as I see them here. Make sure you're dipping down for the pinky arc. It's actually much shorter proportions than the middle fingers. Okay, so roughly this arc that you're seeing here, we want to replicate it here. And also for our second joints, what do you see the proportion between the first knuckle to the second joint and then the second joint to the fingertips? It looks like maybe 2 to 1, sort of, like a little bit. So we're just going to kind of do the arcs roughly about like that. So you can see that the fingertips kind of extend past the bounding box, and that's fine. They should. Okay, so it's roughly maybe like 3 to 2, perhaps more like a 3 to 2 ratio is what we're seeing here. But we want to get those arcs in there. If our arcs are off, then our finger proportions will be off. So we have to make sure that we kind of get these arcs more or less reasonable here. Okay. So now to get our thumb proportions, we can then drag the arc downward like this to kind of figure out where our where our thumb segment should lie. Okay, so you can see here, if I just keep my thumb relaxed like here, you can see that the arc here at the knuckles kind of corresponds to where the first joint of the thumb is. So I'm just going to pull it out sideways, and that'll help me gauge. Okay, and then here for the arc of the first joint, I can pull it out and kind of figure out where my thumb is supposed to be. Okay. All right, now we can start drawing our segments for all of our fingers. But let's write down that step that we just did. That's step 4 would be to draw arcs. So draw arcs at knuckles, first and second joints, and fingertips. Okay. All right, so notice that we're still using our H or 2H or 4H pencil for our preliminary marks because we're on our final drawing, we're going to want to erase them, so continue using that. I'm just using the ebony so I can write these words darker for you. Okay, so now we're going to imagine our finger segments as shapes. Now take a look at, let's start with the base or the first joint or first segment of our thumb here. What 3D shape could this be represented as? It looks like a cylinder. Okay, so we're going to draw a cylinder. However, we're going to make the cylinder in the same angles that we're seeing them in our hand. Okay, so I'm going to do a cylinder here. And just keep looking at your hand and make a cylinder. And remember, it has an oval for top and bottom. Right, so we're drawing our cylinder, and we're drawing the thumb as a cylinder here. And then what shape about the fingertip? What shape is that? That's actually looking more like a truncated cone, which we call a frustum. Okay, so we're going to do a circle that's narrower for the top fingertip, and then we're going to draw the sides of the frustum so that they connect with the cylinder that was the first joint. Okay. Now we can actually round this out a little bit. I mean, that could be our next step, but we can make this a more realistic shape. You see how this curves here like a taco shell? We can create that curve here naturally instead of doing strictly a frustum shape. We can actually curve it because we see this curvature here. Okay, so let's make a curve instead of a straight side for the frustum, and it's already looking a lot more thumb tip-like. Okay. And then there's a bit of a curve here as well. We can refine the contours later. Yeah, so we're going to continue drawing our 3D shapes for the hand. Now, sometimes we run into trouble with apportioning the width of the fingers, distributing it. And so I'm going to give you a little guideline here. We're going to split the space in half here. Okay, so half of the width of the back is supposed to be for 2 of your fingers and half of it's for the other 2. Okay, because sometimes when we get carried away, we just kind of like make some fingers too fat and some fingers too skinny. Let's just apportion the space right away. So here, I'm going to leave half of the width for my pinky and 4th finger, and then half for my middle finger and my pointer finger here. So let's make this halfway line right here just so we can split up the space equally. Okay, and now we're going to draw the segments for the other fingers. Okay, so we can start with, let's start with the middle and the pointer finger because these are the larger segments. And we're going to continue drawing our cylinders to represent these segments. So I'm going to draw a round oval shape for the top of this line segment, and I'm going to be paying attention to the angles of these segments. So I'm going to do a rounded top and bottom for my cylinder here, and then also for my pointer finger, it's at a slightly different angle. And you notice the negative space between the fingers as well. That's very important to see that. You see there's kind of this triangle of space here. This triangle, so let's preserve that. So this is how we're also using our perception of spaces to help us draw accurately, because we see this negative space here. Okay, so let's take a look at the negative space and draw the angles of our fingers. Sometimes in perspective, our finger segments can also look as frustums, so that maybe they're not always strictly cylinders. You can make the sides more angled, so it's more like a frustum. So you can see it's maybe slightly narrower here than it was here, and that's how I'm going to represent it. Okay, so we're going to continue to do, I'm just going to do the first segment of each of my fingers all the way across. So I'm going to take a look at my fourth finger now. And you can see how I'm being aware of where the arcs are and letting those guide me, but I don't have to be a slave to them. If I notice that the arc is maybe off, then I can adjust as I go along. And you can see there's actually no negative space between my middle and fourth fingers here, so be aware of that. Don't make a space when there's no space. Our fingers have a nice amount of volume to them. Okay, so I'm going to get the end of my finger here. Okay, now I'm going to do the pinky finger. And it has a slight upward angle to the segment, kind of coming out of the box a little bit, and that's fine. We don't have to stay in the box. The box is helping us simply with the general placement and proportions. And take a look at the negative space as well. It's a very thin sliver of space here on my hand, but double check with your hand and what's going on with your hand. You're not drawing my hand, you're drawing your own hand. Okay, so I see the ends of my cylinders, like so. Okay, okay, and now we're going to do the second finger segments up to that next arc, and taking a look at proportions as well as we go along. So I'm going to take a look at my hand from my perspective. What you're seeing on the camera might not be exactly what I'm going to be drawing, because I'm still looking at my hand kind of as I see it from my perspective, so it might vary from what you see on the camera. Okay, so now I'm really noticing more of a frustum shape to my segments as they taper as they go along. Okay, so I've got this one here. I'm going to be taking a look at the relative position on the arc and trying to get the angles of these segments correct. So look at the angles on the side of your fingers, and then over here. So these fingers almost seem to be coming together over here. They're kind of placed together. There's still no negative space between them, so you definitely have to take a look at that negative space and make sure you're not putting a space where there is none. Okay, so they almost look like there's no space between them. Okay, so I'll draw them as that. And then over here from my pinky, I'm going to draw the segments for my pinky. And there's a bit of negative space here, so I see that I have that negative space here and here, so that works out. Okay, so now we're going to do our fingertips, and we're going to take a look at those end shapes, and we're going to follow the same kind of thing we did with the thumb tip, in that it's more like a taco shell type of shape. Okay, it is a frustum, however, there is a curvature to the finger pad, and we're going to build that into our shapes. Okay, so now let me get my pinky fingertip here, making sure that it's following the arcs. And instead of doing a straight side to my frustum, I'm going to make it a little bit curved, just like so. Okay. And don't be afraid of going past your arcs for your fingers, because that's perfectly fine. That's how it appears. Okay, so I know my fingertip goes a bit farther here. You want to get a bit of roundness to the tips of the fingers, so you can kind of draw the end of the frustum, the top end of it. like so. This one, there's a little more foreshortening in my pointer finger here, so it's kind of like a bit odd of a shape. Okay. So here we have the end of the finger, and then we're going to curve it a bit for the finger pad. Okay, so I've got the rough relative lengths, and you can see how I went in and out of these arcs. I didn't follow them slavishly. My fingers actually peered more because it wasn't that accurate. So let's use a bit of Gestalt here when we're looking over the big picture, and really flick your eyes between your hand and your drawing and make sure you've got those proportions right. Even if you thought you did your arcs right, maybe they weren't so correct. So you can see how I went outside of my arc as I was drawing the details, the segments, and I noticed that some finger segments were actually much longer, and actually this pinky should probably be a bit shorter now that I'm looking at it again. So just go ahead and adjust some of your segments just to reflect what's actually there versus kind of what you planned. Okay, so my pinky finger should really be a bit shorter, and my middle finger should be a bit longer. All right. Now I gotta put in my wrist. So let's write down the steps that we have just done. We drew our finger segments. Okay, so we draw finger segments. Draw finger segments as what shapes? Cylinders and frustums, or your truncated cones. Okay. Now we're going to continue here by using some of the lessons we learned from doing our blind contour drawings. We are going to carefully look at all of the contours and superimpose them onto this structure that we've created using our 3D shapes, so that our contours can be really accurate while having this really nice structure here that helps us get our proportions and our use of space correct. Okay, so now we're going to get our edges. We're going to use our perception of edges to really get accurate contours. At this point, I'm currently holding an H, but I'm going to move on to a medium hardness pencil. I'm going to grab a B. You can use a B or an HB, and instead of your 2H or 4H. And now we're going to finalize some contours and really look carefully around your hand and make sure that it's reflecting the actual contours that we're seeing. So I kind of like to just follow the line. So I'm going to start at the bottom left side with the base of my hand where it touches my wrist. And I'm just going to follow the contours really carefully, looking back and forth from my hand to my drawing and making sure that it's the edges that I'm seeing. So remember, this is almost like our modified blind contour drawing, where we really are just observing the edge and getting all the minuteness of detail in the edge and superimposing that onto the structure that we've built using 3D shapes. So remember how when you did the modified blind contour, you actually were able to get such detail in that edge. And that's what we're looking for here. We're trying to get that detail here. Okay. So at the same time, we can look at the details, the interior details as well. So I have this interior detail of the thumbnail. That's kind of this kind of soft, rounded quadrilateral shape here. And we can build in some of the details as we are drawing our more accurate contours. So we're looking at our hand. Okay, so here I'm going to continue to refine my contours as I see them, studying the edge of my fingers very, very carefully so I can get every detail and accuracy in all of my contours. Okay, and then at the fingertips, I'm going to draw my fingernails, and they're kind of a boxy shape, but not quite, because there's a different roundness to the fingernails. They're boxy, but also not at the same time. Okay, so I'm going to continue with these details. And I notice here that I'm actually extending the length of my middle finger as we speak. So at any time you can keep refining your proportions. As you're drawing, you may find your proportions were not quite accurate as you were doing it. The structure, so you can continue building on that and making it more accurate as you go along. Okay, and you can also refine some of your details by using your eraser. Okay, so we're going to go around and refine our details, refine our edges. Okay, superimposing it onto our structure here. And get those creases at the base of the fingers correct too. Those are so important here. So I noticed that there's this crease going this way. We want to get those creases at the base of our fingers as well. Study those contours of your fingers. I can see my flesh bulged here a little bit. You want to capture that. Okay, capture all those creases or how the finger is swelling and here and there. So basically going all the way around, just like we did with our modified blank contour. Your eye is just studying the continuous edge of your hand, going all the way around. And I notice there's a bit of a bulge in the flesh here, my finger, and here again. Okay, I noticed that if you notice that your line is kind of fuzzy, it may be because you need to sharpen your pencil. So you can always use that, sharpen your pencil right now. I'm going to grab another pencil that's maybe a little more sharp. Okay. Okay, so let's continue. Oop. Make sure your hand is not moving. If you want to reposition your hand so that it's in the correct position. There, that's better. Okay, so I've got a sharpened pencil, and that's producing a more accurate line for me now. And I'm going to refine the contours of my thumb now. I notice that the roundness here, I'll make sure I get this proportion correct. I don't want to get it too far along here. Okay. I notice that my thumb joint protrudes a little more here. So I'm going to show that. And then inside here, there's perhaps bulges a little bit here. I feel like maybe my thumb joint there's something not quite right here. So I feel like it's the angle here. So I'm going to change this a little bit. Taking a look here. Okay, you see I'm adjusting all the way through this. There's nothing set in stone. That's why we're using pencil. You can always adjust things if they look wrong. Don't keep throwing, committing yourself to whatever you've drawn before. You can always change it. You don't lose anything from it. In fact, you gain more accuracy if you're changing what you've done. Okay, so now I'm going to get the angle of my thumb not quite right. Okay, chasing after this correct profile here. Okay, so I noticed that this kind of bulges here. I see a bulge here, my finger. Okay, so I've gone around all the way around from one side of the wrist to the other, studying the edge and minute detail and superimposing that onto the structure I created, trying to get some of those details right. Like here with my thumbnail. Okay, now you can go ahead and do the interior details. So if we take a look at some of these creases, you see the creases here and there all over the thumb, or all over the knuckles, and you get some of those interior details. Okay, so you see the creases here and there. you're going to draw those creases. Okay, so let's write down the step that we just did. We finalize your contours and add details. And add details. Details such as fingernails, skin creases, skin folds, and the like. Okay. So now the last step is, this is still kind of looking like just a hand, and the hand is not complete without that tapering at the wrist. So we're going to just draw the wrist. We're going to draw the wrist with an opening. That's really important because sometimes I've seen some students kind of just close off the hand here and it looks like a disembodied hand. We want to imply that the body continues by leaving an opening at the end of the wrist. Because if you just cut it off, it looks oddly like a very realistic cut off hand. Okay, so we don't want to do that. We want to leave it open at the wrist. Okay, so you can notice how much the wrist tapers here. And you can just compare the width of the wrist versus the base of the hand. Make sure that it's definitely tapering. Not too much, not too little, but just looking at it realistically. Okay, so now we've added the wrist. Now the really last step would probably be to do some line variation. But let's continue with some of these details. We are just doing perception of edges here, so we're actually just doing contour lines. We are not shading at this stage, but you can represent some of these details. I know it's hard not to want to shade, but you can reduce the details that you're seeing on the back of the hand to simple lines to represent some of these shaded areas. Okay, so we're just representing some things as lines. Maybe you see some veins. You can just do some subtle lines to represent some of the kind of changes in structure that you're seeing on the back of the hand. Okay, and that concludes using 3D shapes to draw the hand.